So, the former British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, yes, the ghoul from the early 2000s who not only helped George Bush invade Afghanistan, but also lied about Iraq. He lied about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. He lied about Iraq's non-existent links with Al-Qaeda. And so he has come out of the woodwork, the very same Tony Blair who helped start the war in Afghanistan, and is now calling the withdrawal imbecilic. Actually, to be more precise, he's calling the slogan of ending forever wars imbecilic. And this is very rich coming from an imbecile, right? So, I mean, just to show you a headline over here from Politico, okay, it says, Tony Blair, the Afghanistan withdrawal is quote-unquote imbecilic. And there's another quote underneath. It says, the world is now uncertain of where the West stands, wrote Blair, who was UK Prime Minister during the 2001 Afghanistan invasion. So, again, Prime Minister, that's a very funny title for a war criminal. But yes, he was in charge. And so he wrote this giant piece on his website, right, which is the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, which sounds exactly like, you know, some kind of evil institution that is, you know, hell-bent on destroying the world would sound like. So yes, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And indeed, the change was global. He wrote this huge thing unpacking it and saying that, oh my God, you know, Russia and China are going to take advantage now. You know, because obviously when the media says things like, oh my God, we're leaving Afghanistan, and now this is going to benefit China and Russia and you know, Iran, what they actually mean is that Iran and China no longer have a NATO base or bases on their borders, which obviously would benefit anyone in their right mind. Nevertheless, he of course, you know, he makes no mention of the victims that he's, you know, whose blood he has on his hands. He just thinks that, oh, you know, the West is the victim and we look bad now and we should be, you know, we shouldn't have abandoned the Afghans. And again, it's this weird paradox. He thinks that, you know, it was very good for the UK to invade Afghanistan and that this achieved a lot of things, but they can't leave because, well, nothing's changed, right? It's the whole paradox. So, let me just read you very quickly from Tony Blair, right? He says, we didn't need to do it, we chose to do it. Okay, he's talking about the withdrawal. We didn't need to do it, we chose to do it. We did it in obedience to an imbecilic political slogan about ending the quote-unquote forever wars, as if our engagement in 2021 was remotely comparable to our commitment 20 or even 10 years ago. And in circumstances in which troop numbers had declined to a minimum and no Allied soldier had lost their life in combat for 18 months. And again, he's basically saying, well, why should we leave? You know, occupation is okay. The conditions are a bit different. So he doesn't mind that the UK is illegally occupying another country. The US is illegally occupying this country. You know, he's saying we didn't have to leave. We could have just stayed forever, right? Forever occupations, more like it. And so he also starts spreading more lies in the piece that he wrote. So what does he say over here? Over here, he writes that he talks about 3,000 people on US soil on 11th of September. The world was in turmoil. The attacks were organized out of Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda, an Islamist terrorist group, given protection and assistance by the Taliban. We forget this now, but the world was spinning on its axis. We feared further attacks, possibly worse. The Taliban were given an ultimatum: yield up the Al-Qaeda leadership or be removed from power so that Afghanistan could not be used for further attacks. They refused. And this is, of course, a complete lie, because as you can see from what I posted directly on the right, this is from The Guardian from October 2001, from the time of the invasion. And what does the headline say? It says, George Bush, meaning the US president at the time, Bush rejects Taliban offer to hand bin Laden over. And yet, if you look at what Tony Blair is writing right now in 2021 on the left, he says the Taliban were given an ultimatum: yield up the Al-Qaeda leadership or be removed from power. Well, they offered you that, and you guys didn't want it. So what happened is that the Taliban, they first demanded, well, hold on a second. You need to prove that bin Laden is behind this, right? Which is due process. You know, when Western countries talk about being democracies. What do they mean by democracies? What is one element of that? So you have due process. You have a legislative, an executive and a judiciary that work based on order. And when you go and accuse someone of something in a functioning judiciary, there must be due process. And so the Taliban were like, well, before we give you bin Laden, can you prove that he did 9/11? And, they of course rejected this, the UK and the US, and they just invaded him. Now, the thing is that the Taliban offered to give bin Laden over to a neutral country, if I recall correctly. They didn't say we're going to give him directly to the UK or the US. They just said they'll hand him over to a neutral country if the UK and the US can prove that he was behind it. And they offered this several times. And the United States still refused it, and they invaded Afghanistan anyway. So obviously someone is lying here. Someone is lying here, and it's obviously Tony Blair, right? Or Tony Blair, as he's famously called. So, this bastard, I mean, he's just really something else. And he gives an interview on Sky News also, right? So he's asked over here. I'm going to play it for you.
And can help, and we should.
Go back 20 years, would you do it again?
Well, I've no doubt at the time it was the right thing to do, because if you have a terrorist attack killing 3,500 innocent people in the United States of America, and it comes out of a country run by an extremist government harboring the people who carried out that terrorist attack and would carry out then more terrorist attacks if you allowed them to carry on doing so. Look, we felt at the time, and I believe rightly, that there was no alternative but to say to the Taliban government at the time, you either give up the Al-Qaeda leadership or we're going to remove you from government.
Here we go again. He's still lying. He's still lying. The Taliban offered to give up bin Laden if they could prove that he was behind it. And you have to keep in mind, when was the attack? On September 11th, 2001. By October, so not even a month later, the NATO was already going into Afghanistan. It started with the CIA. So the CIA paramilitaries, we talked about this, they were the first in Afghanistan, and of course they had air support, right? So the Taliban was telling the US, stop bombing us, and we'll give over bin Laden, just stop the bombing. And the US was like, no. So they wanted the war to happen. And he's still lying about it. God, he just can't stop lying, this man. He's unbelievable.
So the point is, this could have turned out differently, and it should have.
Yeah.
And I'm not criticizing people in a foolish way. I know how difficult it is to take these decisions. We made mistakes.
Understatement of the century, literally.
A lot of mistakes have been made, but the fact is the country did have a chance. And it was really our own internal short-term politics in the West that has driven, in the last couple of years, us to put at risk what we gained. And I think it's only now that we're realizing in this moment of crisis exactly how much we gained and how foolish it is to lose it.
So again, the point here is that you have a mountain of war crimes, a mountain of evidence showing that Tony Blair and George Bush lied, and their cabinets as well. And we're in 2021, and he's still trying to justify it. He still won't admit that he was full of it. Okay, take a look at again. I hate to bring these two on the screen, but here's George Bush and Tony Blair, and this speech, if I'm not mistaken, this was given in November. Yeah, I think it was in November 2001. So this is 1 month after the invasion, right, of Afghanistan. So let's take a look at what they're saying. War criminal catwalk.
The last time we were standing here, I was getting ready to give an address to the United States Congress, and I fully believe we're making great progress. I told the American people many times, and I've told the press corps many times, that this is a struggle that's going to take a while. That it's not one of these Kodak moments. There's no moment to this. This is a long struggle in a different kind of war. But we're patient, and our close friends are patient, which is bad news for the Taliban and the people they harbor.
First of all, can I say how pleased I am to be back at the White House in the company of President Bush. Literally, we have destroyed virtually all the terrorist training camps of al-Qaeda. We've destroyed an enormous amount of the military infrastructure of the Taliban. Their air power, insofar as it existed, is completely taken out. We therefore have a very, very strong situation from which to move forward. Commitment to making sure that this is a battle in which we will...
Did you see what...
Can I just say a word on that, Adam?
Did you hear what he just said?
Taken out. We therefore... structure of the Taliban. Their air power is, insofar as
he just said
completely taken out.
He just said we've destroyed all of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So why did you stay? This is 1 month after the invasion. And he's saying, look at all this progress we've done. We've gotten rid of al-Qaeda. It's over. We're in 2021, 20 years later. And he's still saying, well, you know, we're not really done. You know, you see, there's a lot of... This guy's unbelievable. Unbelievable. And just, again, I'm not so sure how familiar you guys are with Tony Blair, which, I mean, you all should be, but I just want to play you some other clips of him lying, and just, it speaks for itself. It speaks for itself.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population.
Again, with this lie. So this was another huge lie that Tony Blair put out, right? He said that Saddam Hussein not only has chemical weapons and biological weapons, and you name it, he can cook, you know, bubonic plague inside of a trailer within 5 minutes. No, he said he can mount an attack in 45 minutes. He's so powerful. He's eluded the entire Western intelligence apparatus, and he can mount an attack in 45 minutes. We have to go to war quickly, quickly, quickly. And the entire thing turned out to be a pile of horse manure, completely made up. And there, you had an entire inquiry into Tony Blair, the Chilcot inquiry, right? And this is in 2016. And you know what Tony Blair does? This is what he does. After this inquiry, he says, I express more sorrow, regret, and an apology than you can ever believe. Okay? And he says that he's sorry. But again, he still defends the choice to join the US military. So we have a history here of Tony Blair repeating complete fabrications, lying through his goddamn teeth. And then even when he's caught, he's like, look, I'm very, very sorry. And you know, this turned out the other way, but I would still do it again. Right? So he's learned nothing. And he's still trying to justify this crap. In 2016, he's still trying to justify Iraq. In 2021, he's still trying to justify Afghanistan. And of course he is. Of course he is, because that's what he's known for. And he will always be known for just that, for being a stinking, lying war criminal. That's it. That is it. That is his legacy. That is Tony Blair's legacy. He's a lying sack of crap. And he stood there in Parliament, and he made the case for war in Afghanistan, and he made the case for war in Iraq, and he lied and he lied. And there are millions of people who've been killed, who've been displaced, and he still doesn't learn. He still thinks that, oh, well, you know, the image, the reputation of the West is at stake. And, you know, like, forget the Afghans, right? Forget the Iraqis. No, it's about the West. And, you know, oh, this is such an imbecilic slogan. Jesus. And of course, what he's saying also in his statement, right? What he's saying in his statement is that we can't leave Afghanistan. Why? Because it's going to turn into a stronghold for terrorism again. And this is incredible. This is incredible to me, because if you have been paying attention to what happened in 2001 and ever since, who are the hijackers on 9/11? 15 of the 19 were from where? Afghanistan? No. Were they from Iraq? No, they're from Saudi Arabia. Have you ever heard Tony Blair say a word about Saudi Arabia? Have you ever heard George Bush say a word about Saudi Arabia? Have you heard any US politician or British politician say a word about Saudi Arabia? And I'm not just talking about 9/11. We're talking about the whole, exporting Wahhabism, all of these other groups that they've been building up in Syria. Not a word. Not a word. And I want to play you a little speech over here. I want to play you a little speech in a second. But I just, another thing. Another thing that Tony Blair says over here. This is in his statement, right? Listen to what he says over here, trying to justify the invasion.
The size it was 20 years ago. This year there would have been roughly 200,000 Afghans going to university, of which 50,000 were women. You know, if you look at the education system and how it's changed, and remember, the majority of Afghans have grown up not under the Taliban. It's a young population. Now, I think the story's not over for Afghanistan, and it's very clear to me speaking to people.
Okay, again, when I played you this speech by Tony Blair just a few moments ago, when he was standing next to George Bush, was he saying, well, you know, now women can go to university in Afghanistan and there are such and such developments with the economy? No, 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 no. You said you're going to Afghanistan to get rid of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. No one invited you or asked you to go to Afghanistan and invade that country so that women can go to university, even though that's a great thing. So he's deflecting now. He's deflecting from that and saying the economy is 3 times the size, right? So he says that in his statement on his website, not in the interview, right? And then he says that you have 50,000 women who can go to university. Yeah, but there's 50,000 dead Afghans, and that's a conservative estimate. That's the conservative estimate. You have to consider there are people from Pakistan who've been killed also in this war on terror, right? With drones and other methods and all of this. And you have to consider that you have millions of people that have been displaced. It's not, you know, people think that the casualties, it's just a number of deaths. No, you have people who are wounded. You have people who have psychological trauma, you know, PTSD or other mental illnesses or anxieties that develop from being in a war zone. You have people who are displaced. They become refugees. These are also casualties. They're not deaths and critical casualties, but they're also casualties. And that's on him. So now he's saying, well, look, you know, some women can go to university, which is a great thing, but you invaded a fucking country. And now you're trying to make it about the size of the economy? I don't give a shit what size the economy is. Why are Afghans living in poverty then? How do you explain that? The economy is 3 times the size. Yeah, and who benefited from that? Not people in Afghanistan, obviously. At least not the majority of them. Why are so many of them trying to flee? Why are so many of them refugees now? You destroyed this country. This is the bottom line. You destroyed this country. You destroyed Iraq. You destroyed Afghanistan. And he's trying to deflect and talk about human rights. And no, 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 no. And the people who are interviewing him, they're just like, well, you know, I'm just not going to say anything. And I'm going to let him, no pushback, nothing. I mean, to be fair, it's 18 minutes. You should watch it. But it's kind of like a softball interview, honestly, really. There's no mention of war crimes. There's nothing, right? And I find this absolutely incredible that Tony Blair is able to sit and give interviews. Like, just pause for a moment. Think of this. This guy decided to invade 2 countries with George Bush and kill and displace millions of people, okay? And he is a free man. He can just like sit and you know, in a suit, and he can give interviews, and he's like, what? What is that? Do you know in 2017, people tried to take him to court for war crimes, and it failed. You know why it failed? Because there's a high court judge who blocked it. They said some ridiculous, absurd reasoning, something along the lines of, well, you know, there's no equivalent of a war of aggression under British common law. And you know why that is? Because, again, I've gone through this when I covered the ICC and Palestine and all this. Because when they ratified the Rome Statute, okay, they had 3 major crimes. I think it was genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And then later they added crime of aggression, a war of aggression, which is what Tony Blair did, what George Bush did. They started a war, not out of self-defense, but because it was simply aggression. invading Iraq, invading Afghanistan, war of aggression. And so people tried to take him to court for that. And the judges in the High Court blocked it. And they're like, no, there's no equivalent of that under British common law, which is unfortunately true. You know why? Because the UK didn't ratify it, even though it's been added to the Rome Statute later on, after 98 and 2001. So, you know, he's scot-free. He can just walk around and give interviews and still justify his obscene criminality. I mean, what Bush and Blair did, these are some of the worst crimes of this century. Surely you know this. Surely anyone with half a brain knows this. There's no disputing that. No disputing that. And he's allowed to just walk free. And meanwhile, what happens to people who expose not wars, but specifically this war on terror, right? Like Julian Assange. He's in jail. So do you see the difference here where, you know, you publish evidence of the crimes that they committed, Tony Blair, George Bush, and everyone since, you go to jail. But if you're the one committing the crimes, it's okay. You're a free man. High Court will protect you. I mean, this is just emblematic of what the state apparatus, you know, what the judiciary is made for and who it serves. Because if you look at this country and you see, well, this war criminal can walk free, and a journalist who exposes his war crimes, right, and the crimes of his colleagues and other world leaders is in jail, then what does that tell you about this country and this society and this judiciary? What kind of values and morals does that convey to you as a rational human being? So this is just utterly scandalous. And I want to play you over here a speech by George Galloway. And again, George Galloway, for me, when I grew up, when I was growing up, and like, how do I know George Galloway? He's anti-war. Like he always stood out to me, and I always remember him to this day, and I always respect him because why? He's anti-war. He's a real anti-imperialist, right? He was against Afghanistan. He was against Iraq. He's against all of it. He's one of the only people with a backbone. You know, it doesn't mean I agree with him on every single thing in the world, but when it comes to this, he's correct, right? George Galloway, Chris Williamson, they come correct. There are very few politicians with a spine. And George Galloway is definitely a politician with a spine. And he's a brilliant political analyst. And I just want to play you this clip over here and what he says about Tony Blair. Okay?
Saudi Arabia. Has he ever raised his voice about the situation of women in Saudi Arabia? Never. How could he? He's on the payroll.
You know it.
My anger and contempt for these people, as you can tell, is bottomless. But that doesn't mean I'm with Joe Biden. The United States and its satrapies, like Britain, France, the Netherlands, and so on, have withdrawn from Afghanistan because they lost a war. No matter what firepower they were able to put on the battlefield, or more particularly to rain down from the skies, they could not defeat these ragged-assed Taliban. And so they left, because even the United States cannot go on fighting a war for 20 years and then another 20 years. That stuff belongs in Orwellian fiction. We have always been at war with Afghanistan. But because I recognize the fact that the Taliban are now the power in Afghanistan, able to summon Hamid Karzai and Abdullah to their council and give them jobs, to put some lipstick on the face of the new Taliban administration, doesn't mean, as some idiots who can only think in binary seem to think, that I am somehow with the Taliban. Don't you dare try and put the Taliban on me. I was opposing the Taliban and their fathers and their uncles when Britain and the United States were stuffing guns and money and propaganda support down their throat.
Told you, man. George Galloway is the man. George Galloway is the man. He always is. He always is. And I love his comments at the end, because this is something that would always come up even back then, right? So if in 2003 or 2002, people were saying like, oh, we shouldn't invade Iraq, what would people say? They would say, oh, you support Saddam Hussein, right? It's just like now, if you say the US should get out of Syria, say, oh, are you an Assadist? Like they can't think except in binary. These are sheep. And so the same thing is being said now. They're saying if you are against US intervention and occupation, do you support the Taliban? You know, this is obscene. This is obscene. And George rightfully points out the fact that the West was giving these people weapons. A lot of these same people weapons. Not that long ago. Not that long ago. And the same can be said for Al-Qaeda. Even more so. So Tony Blair, I mean, is a scourge upon humanity, just like George Bush. I mean, when you think of the worst leaders in modern history, without a doubt, these two, these are devils. These are absolute devils. And I don't think anyone can look at the war on terror, or as I call it, the war of terror, and think that this is okay. How can you look at this war of terror and not see that it has caused more suffering and displacement and death and casualties and maiming than anything else in modern history? And the fact that the media allow him to do this, right? They give him a blank check, like, yes, come on, Mr. Blair, and just spout your nonsense and then you can leave. Well, no one has learned anything, honestly. They haven't learned anything. And you know, instead of interviewing, I don't know, maybe some Afghans, since it's their country, you know, instead of maybe giving the facts, showing that these wars caused immense suffering and tragedy, no, they just default back to the same people who started the wars. And it's just like when you see Ellen and when you see a whole slew of late-night hosts trying to rehabilitate George Bush as some guy who just paints, and some friendly uncle figure, and even Donald Rumsfeld, bringing on Donald Rumsfeld and trying to rehabilitate him. What a sick, perverted society, honestly. What a sick society. So, unfortunately, as long as Tony Blair and George Bush are free, and their cabinets are free, and the people who started the war on terror are free, we cannot talk about being a civilized, just society, because this is the pinnacle of injustice. And it's that simple. So Tony Blair can talk about women's rights and university and all of these things as much as he wants. That does not change the fact that he destroyed this country, and he destroyed Iraq as well. And he is a liar of the highest order. And when he was with George Bush, because this was part of the inquiry, right? This is what he was writing to George Bush, not about Afghanistan, but about Iraq. He says, with you, whatever. These were in his letters, right, to George Bush. And he was pledging unconditional support and saying, we'll do whatever you want. And, you know, like a real lapdog. You know what I mean? And I think it even says here, when they're talking about, you know, when Tony Blair is talking to George Bush in these letters, you can see how they're planning Iraq. They're talking about Afghanistan before they've invaded Iraq. And they're saying this is going to help us with phase 2. Phase 2 meaning the invasion of Iraq. So they planned all this crap well in advance. And we know from the Americans, we know from Dick Cheney, you know, George Tenet, all these people in Bush's administration, how they were cooking the evidence against Saddam. And on the day of 9/11, what did Dick Cheney's lawyer do? David Addington, which is unheard of, that the vice president's lawyer is drafting executive orders. He's coming in and starting the mass surveillance program. You know what became, so it was called the Presidential Surveillance Program, and then it became PRISM and all these various things inside of the NSA. The day of 9/11, within 24 hours, they started that, and they kept it secret for years. What does that tell you? What does that tell you? These people had an agenda from day one. They had an agenda. They wanted to go to war. They don't care. Taliban wanted to give them Osama bin Laden. They don't care. that there were no WMDs in Iraq, there was no link to Al-Qaeda. They don't care. They fabricated and cooked all of this and planned it well in advance. Absolutely scandalous, honestly. And he has the nerve to call this slogan about ending forever wars imbecilic. Like he reduces it to a slogan, right? As if people who are anti-war are just chanting some like political campaign slogan. How dare you, honestly? How dare you? Talk about imbecilic. Dude, George Bush is an idiot. Besides being a war criminal, he's an idiot. You followed George Bush into 2 wars and you have the nerve to call other people imbecilic? Look in the mirror, pal. Unbelievable.